Hi, and welcome to another episode of NXIVM on Trial, a Times Union podcast. I am Casey Seiler, the editor-in-chief of the Times Union.
I'm Jessica Marshall, multimedia producer and producer of NXIVM on Trial.
I'm Robert Gavin, the Times Union's courts and cops reporter.
And we have gathered on this Tuesday morning to talk about the third episode of the second season of HBO's The Vow, a documentary series about the very strange organization known as NXIVM and the downfall of Keith Raniere, the man known within the organization as Vanguard. The title of this episode, gang, is Stimulus and Response, and it focused, I think it's fair to say, on NXIVM's work with individuals living with Tourette Syndrome. And for those not familiar with it, Tourette Syndrome is a neurological condition that results in tics, outbursts of language. Rob, I think it's fair to say that the best known NXIVM believer who dealt with Tourette's was Mark Elliott.
Correct. Yeah, Mark Elliott, the family comes from St. Louis. Later moved to New York City. And Mark is currently one of the diehard supporters of Keith Raniere and NXIVM. Mark was someone who had Tourette syndrome, and he was dealing with it all his life. And he joined NXIVM. And as he said in episode 3 of The Vow, he didn't join NXIVM just to help him overcome Tourette's. He joined it for whatever reason that anyone else joins it. It's a personal growth company going in, right? So when he joins, the experience he has, and he later credits to NXIVM and Keith Raniere and Nancy Salzman, is that he overcomes his Tourette's, and he later became, the main subject of a movie they made within NXIVM called My Tourette's, which became a big boasting point for NXIVM. We can cure Tourette syndrome. And hearing Mark's perspective on this is interesting when you hear, and I know from personally speaking to them, other people who were part of this sort of experiment to work on people who had this very serious condition. And there are people who were there and believed in it who no longer do. And you saw Isabella, who is someone I got to know a little bit during the trial. You saw other people there. I'm not sure they all went public, but I know at least one of whom spoke at Nancy Salzman's sentencing, who feel traumatized by what happened in NXIVM. And Mark Elliott really is a diehard. He really believes NXIVM cured him of Tourette's. And right after the trial was over, he wanted to have a forum because he was an inspirational speaker. He wanted to have a forum immediately about what he believed was the wrongdoing of Keith Raniere being convicted. So he is a diehard. And what this episode really delves into is his belief in being cured, Nancy Salzman's discussions of it, and really they kind of balance Mark's experience against that of Isabella, who was at the trial every day. And I know that she was privy to information that a lot of other people didn't. She knew more about DOS, even though she wasn't someone really in DOS, but she knew about it and was someone who knew people in DOS. In fact, at the trial, when they did closing statements and India Oxenberg showed up and Isabella gave each other a big hug. Isabella is someone who kind of saw through it, saw what the deception was going on. And in this episode, she even tells Mark, he's saying, oh, well, this is a sorority. They're lying about things. And she's like, no, they were told this was going to be a tattoo, and then they were branded. And he says, well, that would be a crime. That would be assault. And Isabella is essentially saying, yeah. I know. That's why I'm no longer in Albany.
I think that was one of the most disturbing moments of this episode for me. Watching that conversation that was recorded between Isabella and Mark Elliott on Skype or FaceTime or whatever they were using. This was, allegedly recorded kind of during the same time that, Mark Vicente, I should say, and Sarah were kind of, everybody was trying to take NXIVM down. And, you see Isabella talking to Mark, kind of pouring her heart out to someone that she loved and trusted at the time, because he helped her with Tourette's, which, was kind of a miracle in her eyes. And then you hear Mark, trying to talk her out of leaving NXIVM because it could bring back her Tourette's, which is just a very alarming, kind of the worst form of gaslighting that, obviously Mark said it, not Keith Raniere, but kind of where it came from. It's just kind of a very disturbing moment.
Not to get excessively literary here, but that exchange and at other points through this episode, I was reminded of a Stephen King novel called Revival, which came out, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago, and is a really good sort of late Stephen King novel and a sort of H.P. Lovecraft spin on the tale of Faust, in which basically a kind of mad scientist figure can cure people, but of course, not to give it away, it turns out that the after effects are unpleasant. In the character of Mark Elliott, or in the figure of Mark Elliott, but the way he is presented in The Vow, you have somebody who, according to him, has definitely benefited from the treatment that he received from Nancy Stalzman and sort of the role that Keith Raniere played. Elliott gives him a lot of credit, but at the same time, he has sort of swapped that condition for a condition, if you will, where Keith Raniere can do no wrong. And his life has now been, it would appear, completely given over to defending what I think most people would argue is indefensible. And in the character of Isabella Constantino, who we should notice from Buffalo, you have somebody who sort of has resisted that kind of bargain. To follow up kind of on your point, for me, one of the most fascinating scenes was the discussions with Isabella's parents,
Yes.
where her mother is clearly outraged by what she has learned about what was going on within NXIVM, especially DOS, and her dad seemed to be able to compartmentalize what was going on and say, like, it really worked for her. And here again, and this is something that I think I've brought up in our last 2 episodes, a big problem with this is that there is very little interrogation of the people who are being interviewed here, that it's told very first person. And so somebody could watch this episode, and with the exception of just a couple of moments of kind of pushback, the person could come away and say, well, it looks like NXIVM really did have a great technique for helping people beat Tourette syndrome.
Yeah.
And that's why the moments that stood out, and there were 2, one, obviously Moira Penza, the lead federal prosecutor, saying, yeah, I don't believe any of that stuff. I think that the sort of conditioning techniques that Nancy Salzman used, they're very powerful, and in some
It can
cases
work for a small number of people.
Exactly, but it's not reproducible, and there was this title card at the top saying, oh, by the way, this hasn't been scientifically proven. I'm paraphrasing, to cure Tourette's. And
Blink
also,
and you miss it, right?
Yeah, oh, completely. And also, when they're interviewing Mark Elliott, you hear it's one of the rare times that you hear somebody asking a question where he says, so who is Isabella? Or can you talk about Isabella, or something to that effect? And Mark Elliott just immediately kind of shoves it away and says, well, you might want to talk to them about, I'm not going to speak for them, or something to that effect. But it was clear that he did not want to speak about Isabella at all.
So you look at when they show parts of Keith talking about how they got into this effort to get, try to cure Tourette's. And I'll channel my inner Star Wars dork here. And there's this, he says a line, Keith Raniere says, when conventional solutions don't work, maybe the unconventional way of thinking does. And it kind of brought me to the scene in Revenge of the Sith where like Emperor Palpatine is like, the dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider unnatural. And I'm like, that's in a weird way kind of what he's offering, like the unconventional. You don't know what it may bring. But we're not in a world of fiction and science fiction. These are real people and real people's lives. So when you start experimenting with these things and saying unconventional, Mark Elliott May calls Keith Raniere a scientist and a philosopher, but Keith Raniere really isn't a scientist, and he's a self-proclaimed philosopher or self-dubbed philosopher. And these are absolutely real impacts that are happening on people. And I think that's why this brings out so many strong emotions. There was a woman from Wisconsin testified, I should say, gave a victim impact statement at Nancy Salzman's sentencing, said she was 21 and she spent a short period of time NXIVM hoping to have her Tourette Syndrome cured in her early 20s, and that Nancy Salzman had told her she had the condition because she was a quote-unquote parasite and a defiant. And when she faced Nancy Salzman, she said, "You use me as a guinea pig." And this woman still, as of Nancy's sentencing last year, still had Tourette's syndrome. So we're seeing one side of this, and that's Mark Elliott, who's a diehard NXIVM supporter. And you saw Moira Penz's comment about cognitive behavioral change, and there are some people.
If I were the producer of this, up until now, I've been kind of on board, or at least more on board than I guess you guys with kind of the first person telling, because I thought that a lot of what they were saying was, the power of what they were saying could help you fill in the blanks. But in this episode, not so much. If I had done this, I would definitely have brought in some kind of an expert, who is licensed and lauded in their field, an expert on Tourette syndrome, to come and really provide that counterpoint, that sort of scientific counterpoint, like more than just what Moira Penza said, which obviously is something that they would have expanded upon. But you really needed somebody in the expert of the field here in this episode, because it just feels very, very dangerously one-sided.
Jess, I would just note that I've never been on board with that technique. So now you're coming on board, me not being on board. I love it.
Well, I didn't say I was completely on board, but okay. I was willing to, give it the benefit of the doubt.
Yes, I think that's called gangplankism, but not on board, but almost. One thing I'd like to note is anytime in a story about NXIVM, I see somebody in a cranial cap as part of an experiment, it reminds me that one of the things that NXIVM was criticized and investigated for was the fact that it was doing completely unregulated brain experiments under one of its spin-offs, the Ethical Science Foundation, at an emptied out former restaurant space was it in Clifton Park, Rob?
It was, so this is the old restaurant that used to be, I won't mention the current name of it because it has zero affiliation with NXIVM now, but it was in Half Moon. The restaurant was owned by Claire Bronfman. It was called Apropos. And there was a former doctor named Brandon Porter, who was a member of NXIVM. And they did brain experiments in there. And Brandon Porter lost his medical license for conducting these experiments. And
basically, they were bringing people in. They were, fitting them with monitors and showing them a horrible, basically snuff films, right? Scenes of folks being murdered, really traumatizing people. And I just found it strange that this entire episode was devoted to NXIVM's, quote unquote, scientific inquiries. But this episode, at least, didn't even take a second to refer to that stuff. And here again, the timeline is kind of scattered. The timeline of Isabella's experiences and when she fell away from NXIVM, when she is back home dealing with her parents, I kind of wanted a better sense of, was this 2017, 2018, 2019? 2017, the fall of 2017, when NXIVM was exposed and DOS was exposed, and that really began the fall. Keith Raniere arrested in March of 2018, and then, of course, his trial begins in the spring of 2019. What we are getting is a lot of kind of toing and froing to before the fall, during the fall, and then the after the fall. And sometimes it can be very hard to follow, and you are unclear of where people are on the timeline of falling away from Keith Raniere and NXIVM.
It is a little tough. Like I say, I can tell you from being at the trial, covering it there every day, and speaking to Isabella, she was an observer at the trial. I would not have known there was any past history of Tourette's or any other issue from just speaking to her. The way she's talking on the documentary is similar to I think the way she was when I spoke to her. My sense, and I could be wrong, is that it's early 2019 because she talked about going to the trial, and the trial obviously was started in May 2019. But I thought it was fascinating to see the difference in the families, like you mentioned. It's similar to the woman who was kept in the room for 2 years, also in Half Moon. And that's, by the way, I know they say Albany, but when they're showing, and there's sort of a dramatic moment where they show Isabella leaving in the middle of the night, putting her stuff in a van and just getting out of the capital region, that appears to be, based on what I know, to be the Knox Woods apartment complex in Half Moon, where so many NXIVM members had lived. And I know that Isabella had lived with women who were in DOS. And I know that she was around, obviously, a lot of those people. So she knew information Mark Elliott probably was not as privy to. But what I thought was interesting is it's similar to the situation of the woman kept in the room, where the parents are divided. Like now, even now, to this day, the father of the woman that Keith Raniere had restricted to a room for 2 years, he still supports Keith Raniere. Still. So it is interesting that it shows you, I mean, how tough must it be to leave this organization when the father of someone, the guy who wasn't even in the class, as far as we know, he may never have taken a class, and he's like, well, if it helped, it helped. So it just shows you how difficult it is. And I think,
and how easy it is to justify.
Yeah.
It certainly sets things up interestingly for the next episode, which it would appear is going to be devoted to the testimony and the experience of Lauren Salzman, Nancy's daughter, and one of, if not the most significant witness in the federal trial. But that will be for next week. One thing I would like to note, I guess we can go around the horn and ask for kind of favorite details for this episode. Mine, and I'll get literary once again, is, guys, if you see somebody with a copy of Frank Herbert's Dune on a bookshelf next to a whole bunch of Ayn Rand novels, run.
I noticed the Ayn Rand, but I did not notice Dune. I'll have to go back and
yeah. Dune is right next to the Ayn Rand. That is, nothing wrong with having maybe one Ayn Rand novel. Nothing wrong with having Dune, of course. Read it when I was a teenager, enjoyed it very much. But when you got those next to each other on the bookshelf, that's a troublesome combination there.
I think my moment, to your point, Rob, that you made a little while ago about how they called Isabella's, they deemed it Albany, where Isabella lived. And then in the next scene, they're driving down the Northway and you see the exit for Albany Airport. And I'm like, just this is something that only a local would know, like us. But I'm like, isn't that the other side of the Northway? She is not coming from Albany. She's coming from the north. This is inaccurate factually. But again, only something a local would notice.
What I noticed, what I'm taking from this is a part, I don't know that people who haven't heard or listened to Keith Raniere a lot will necessarily catch on, but when Isabella and Mark Elliott are having that conversation, I'm listening to Mark Elliott, and I know it's Mark Elliott speaking, and I know it's Mark Elliott's words, but I'm hearing Keith Raniere. When I hear the words Mark Elliott is saying to Isabella, it's like she's speaking to Keith. I mean, he sounds like Keith Raniere. He's using words Keith Raniere would use. and it's kind of chilling. It's just like, wow. I mean, it's the same techniques, the same. And again, for what it's worth, people I've talked to on both sides of NXIVM, most people thought Mark was a very nice guy, and that they don't say a bad word about him. But the words he's using, what we saw there, that's very coercive. To say, oh, well, you could get your Tourette's back. I mean, it's the calmness of the voice and the tone. It was Raniere-esque, and I thought that was something that kind of stuck with me from this. And I think you'll see that more and more. People will channel Raniere, and they put him on a pedestal, and he was the vanguard.
And the NXIVM, the NXIVM acolytes, the faithful, will insist, how dare you accuse me of being an empty vessel filled up with Keith Raniere stuffing? That says more about you than it says about me. So that's the defense that, we've already heard a couple of times from, Nikki Klein and others. So, but anyway, that will be for the subject of a future podcast, no doubt. All right. Well, thank you very much for listening again to this episode of NXIVM on Trial. I am Casey Seiler, Editor-in-Chief of the Times-Union.
I'm Jessica Marshall, multimedia producer and producer of NXIVM on Trial.
Rob Gavin, Cops and Courts reporter who covered the NXIVM trial.
Have a great week, and please remember to vote and remember to support local journalism.
If you're enjoying NXIVM on Trial, be sure to check out its sister podcast, The Eagle. I'm Jessica Marshall, host of The Eagle. Each week, we'll take a look inside the newsroom at the Times-Union, the Capital Region's oldest and largest newspaper. We'll discuss the week's top stories, and we'll talk to the award-winning reporters who write them. Listen at timesunion.com or wherever you get your podcasts.